Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 28 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 28 is the third of 8 chapters in Part 8 of 8 of Capital Volume 1. In other words, we are almost at the end. Part 8 concerns primitive accumulation, or how capitalism got started, and Chapter 28's title is Bloody Legislation Against the Expropriated from the End of the 15th Century, Forcing Down of Wages by Acts of Parliament. In Chapter 27, Marx talked about the process of kicking people off of the land, and in this chapter, he's going to talk about how the recently expropriated poor, at least many of them, didn't have anywhere to go yet, because capitalism was getting set up, but it really wasn't expanded to the point where it could employ a lot of these people. So we see in the last chapter description of setting up poor laws and things like that, but a lot of these people ended up homeless, and that was really a new phenomenon on this kind of scale. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at how the ruling class was trying to manage this transition, all the while keeping their own benefit in the forefront. Let's begin. The proletariat, created by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers and by the forcible expropriation of the people from the soil, this, quote, free proletariat could not possibly be absorbed by the nascent manufactures as fast as it was thrown upon the world. On the other hand, these men, suddenly dragged from their wonted mode of life, could not as suddenly adapt themselves to the discipline of their new condition. They were turned en masse into beggars, robbers, vagabonds, partly from inclination, in most cases from stress of circumstances. Hence, at the end of the 15th and during the whole of the 16th century, throughout Western Europe, a bloody legislation against vagabondage. The fathers of the present working class were chastised for their enforced transformation into vagabonds and paupers. Legislation treated them as, quote, voluntary criminals, and assumed that it depended on their own good will to go on working under the old conditions that no longer existed. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII. And then Marx does kind of a timeline here, starting with Henry VIII, 1530. Beggars old and unable to work receive a beggar's license. On the other hand, whipping and imprisonment for sturdy vagabonds. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, then to swear an oath to go back to their birthplace, or to where they have lived in the last 3 years, and to, quote, put themselves to labor. What grim irony. In 27 Henry VIII, the former statute is repeated, but strengthened with new clauses. For the second arrest for vagabondage, the whipping is to be repeated and half the ear sliced off. But for the third relapse, the offender is to be executed as a hardened criminal, an enemy of the common weal. Edward VI, a statute of the first year of his reign, 1547, ordains that if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. The master shall feed his slave on bread and water, weak broth, and such refuse meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chains. If the slave is absent a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life, and is to be branded on forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away thrice, he is to be executed as a felon. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. Justices of the peace on information are to hunt the rascals down. If it happens that a vagabond has been idling about for 3 days, he is to be taken to his birthplace, branded with a red-hot iron, with the letter V on the breast, and be set to work, in chains, in the streets, or at some other labor. If the vagabond gives a false birthplace, he is then to become the slave for life of this place, of its inhabitants, or its corporation, and to be branded with an S. All persons have the right to take away the children of the vagabonds and to keep them as apprentices, the young men until the 24th year, the girls until the 20th. If they run away, they are to become up to this age the slaves of their masters, who can put them in irons, whip them, etc. if they like. Every master may put an iron ring around the neck, arms, or legs of his slave, by which to know him more easily and to be more certain of him. Footnote, the author of the Essay on Trade, etc., 1770, says, quote, in the reign of Edward VI, indeed the English seem to have set, in good earnest, about encouraging manufactures and employing the poor. This we learn from a remarkable statute which runs thus, quote, that all vagrants shall be branded, etc., unquote. Back to the main text. The last part of the statute provides that certain poor people may be employed by a place or by persons who are willing to give them food and drink and to find them work. This kind of parish slaves was kept up in England until far into the 19th century under the name of roundsmen. Elizabeth, 1572. Unlicensed beggars above 14 years of age are to be severely flogged and branded on the left ear, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. In case of a repetition of the offense, if they are over 18, they are to be executed, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. But for the third offense, they are to be executed without mercy as felons. Similar statutes, 18 Elizabeth C. 13 and another of 1597. Footnote, Thomas More says in his Utopia, quote, "Therefore that uncovetous and unsatiable cormorant, and very plague of his native country, may compass about and enclose many thousand acres of ground together within one pale or hedge. The husbandmen be thrust out of their own, or else either by cunning and fraud, or by violent oppression they be put besides it, or by wrongs and injuries they be so wearied that they be compelled to sell all. By one means therefore, or by other, either by hook or crook, they must needs depart away. Poor, sully, wretched souls, men, women, husbands, wives, fatherless children, widows, woeful mothers with their young babes, and their whole household small in substance, and much in number, as husbandry requireth many hands. Away they trudge, I say, out of their known accustomed homes, finding no place to rest in. All their household stuff, which is worth very little, though it might well abide the sale, yet being so dainly thrust out, they be constrained to sell it for a thing of naught. And just when they have wandered abroad till that be spent, what can they else do but steal? And then justly party be hanged, or else go about begging. And yet then also they be cast in prison as vagabonds, because they go about and work not, whom no man will set a work, though they never so willingly proffer themselves thereto." Unquote. Of these poor fugitives of whom Thomas More says that they were forced to thieve, quote, 7,200 great and petty thieves were put to death, unquote, in the reign of Henry VIII. It's according to Holinshed Description of England. In Elizabeth's time, quote, rogues were trussed up apace, and that there was not 1 year commonly wherein 300 or 400 were not devoured and eaten up by the gallows. That's quoting Strype's Annals of the Reformation and Establishment of Religion and other various occurrences in the Church of England during Queen Elizabeth's happy reign, 2nd edition, 1725. Volume 2. According to this same Strype, in Somersetshire in 1 year 40 persons were executed, 35 robbers burned in the hand, 37 whipped, and 183 discharged as, quote, incorrigible vagabonds. Nevertheless, he is of opinion that this large number of prisoners does not comprise even a fifth of the actual criminals, thanks to the negligence of the justices and the foolish compassion of the people. Okay. And the other counties of England were not better off in this respect than Somersetshire, while some were even worse. Back to the main text. James I. Anyone wandering about and begging is declared a rogue and a vagabond. Justices of the peace and petty sessions are authorized to have them publicly whipped, and for the first offense to imprison them for 6 months, for the second for 2 years. Whilst in prison, they are to be whipped as much and as often as the justices of the peace think fit. Incorrigible and dangerous rogues are to be branded with an R on the left shoulder and set to hard labor, and if they are caught begging again, to be executed without mercy. These statutes, legally binding until the beginning of the 18th century, were only repealed by 12 Anne, chapter 23. Similar laws in France, where by the middle of the 17th century a kingdom of vagabonds, or truants, was established in Paris. Even at the beginning of Louis XVI's reign, the Ordinance of July 13, 1777, every man in good health from 16 to 60 years of age, if without means of subsistence and not practicing a trade, is to be sent to the galleys. Of the same nature are the Statute of Charles V for the Netherlands, October 1537, the first Edict of the States and Towns of Holland, March 10, 1614, the Plaquet of the United Provinces, June 26, 1649, etc. Thus were the agricultural people, first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, tortured by laws grotesquely terrible, into the discipline necessary for the wage system. It is not enough that the conditions of labor are concentrated in a mass in the shape of capital at the one pole of society, while at the other are grouped masses of men who have nothing to sell but their labor power. Neither is it enough that they are compelled to sell it voluntarily. The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population keeps the law of supply and demand of labor, and therefore keeps wages in a rut that corresponds with the wants of capital. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Direct force, outside economic conditions, is of course still used, but only exceptionally. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the, quote, natural laws of production, i.e., to their dependence on capital, a dependence springing from, and guaranteed in perpetuity by, the conditions of production themselves. It is otherwise during the historic genesis of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie, at its rise, wants and uses the power of the state to, quote, regulate wages, i.e. to force them within the limits suitable for surplus value making, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the laborer themselves in the normal degree of dependence. This is an essential element of the so-called primitive accumulation. The class of wage laborers, which arose in the latter half of the 14th century, formed then and in the following century only a very small part of the population, well protected in its position by the independent peasant proprietary in the country and the guild organization in the town. In country and town, master and workman stood close together socially. The subordination of labor to capital was only formal, i.e., the mode of production itself had as yet no specific capitalistic character. Variable capital preponderated greatly over constant. The demand for wage labor grew, therefore, rapidly with every accumulation of capital, whilst the supply of wage labor followed but slowly. A large part of the national product, changed later into a fund of capitalist accumulation, then still entered into the consumption fund of the laborer. Legislation on wage labor, from the first aimed at the exploitation of the laborer and, as it advanced, always equally hostile to him, is started in England by the Statute of Laborers of Edward III, 1349. Footnote quoting Adam Smith, whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its counselors are always the masters. Quoting Lange, the spirit of the laws is property. Back to the main text. The Ordinance of 1350 in France, issued in the name of King John, corresponds with it. English and French legislation run parallel and are identical in purport. So far as the labor statutes aim at compulsory extension of the working day, I do not return to them, as this point was treated earlier, Chapter 10, Section 5. The Statute of Laborers was passed at the urgent insistence of the House of Commons. A Tory says naively, quote, "Formerly the poor demanded such high wages as to threaten industry and wealth. Next, their wages are so low as to threaten industry and wealth equally and perhaps more, but in another way." That's quoting Sophisms of Free Trade by a barrister, London, 1850. He adds maliciously, quote, "We were ready enough to interfere for the employer. Can nothing now be done for the employed?" Unquote. A tariff of wages was fixed by law for town and country, for piecework and day work. The agricultural laborers were to hire themselves out by the year, the town ones, quote, "in open market." It was forbidden under pain of imprisonment to pay higher wages than those fixed by the statute, but the taking of higher wages was more severely punished than the giving of them. So also in sections 18 and 19 of the Statute of Apprentices of Elizabeth, 10 days imprisonment is decreed for him that pays the higher wages, but 21 days for him that receives them. A statute of 1360 increased the penalties and authorized the masters to extort labor at the legal rate of wages by corporal punishment. All combinations, contracts, oaths, etc., by which masons and carpenters reciprocally bound themselves, were declared null and void. Coalition of the laborers is treated as a heinous crime from the 14th century to 1825, the year of the repeal of the laws against trades unions. The spirit of the Statute of Laborers of 1349 and of its offshoots comes out clearly in the fact that indeed a maximum of wages is dictated by the state, but on no account a minimum. In the 16th century, the condition of the laborers had, as we know, become much worse. The money wage rose, but not in proportion to the depreciation of money and the corresponding rise in the prices of commodities. Wages, therefore, in reality fell. Nevertheless, the laws for keeping them down remained in force, together with the ear-clipping and branding of those, quote, "whom no one was willing to take into service," unquote, i.e. the unemployed. By the Statute of Apprentices, 5 Elizabeth, Chapter 3, the justices of the peace were empowered to fix certain wages and to modify them according to the time of year and the price of commodities. James I extended these regulations of labor also to weavers, spinners, and all possible categories of workers. Footnote, from a clause of Statute 2, James I, Chapter 6, we see that certain cloth makers took upon themselves to dictate, in their capacity of justices of the peace, the official tariff of wages in their own shops. In Germany, especially after the 30 Years' War, statutes for keeping down wages were general. Quote, The want of servants and laborers was very troublesome to the landed proprietors in the depopulated districts. All villagers were forbidden to let rooms to single men and women. All the latter were to be reported to the authorities and cast into prison if they were unwilling to become servants, even if they were employed at any other work, such as sowing seeds for the peasants at a daily wage or even buying and selling corn. That's from the Imperial Privileges and Sanctions for Silesia 1. For a whole century, in the decrees of the small German potentates, a bitter cry goes up again and again about the wicked and impertinent rabble that will not reconcile itself to its hard lot, will not be content with the legal wage. The individual landed proprietors are forbidden to pay more than the state had fixed by a tariff, and yet the conditions of service were at times better after war than 100 years later. The farm servants of Silesia had, in 1652, meat twice a week, whilst even in our century districts are known where they have it only 3 times a year. Further, wages after the war were higher than in the following century." Unquote. That's from G. Freytag. Back to the main text. George II extended the laws against coalitions of laborers to manufactures. In the manufacturing period par excellence, the capitalist mode of production had become sufficiently strong to render legal regulation of wages as impractical as it was unnecessary. But the ruling classes were unwilling, in case of necessity, to be without the weapons of the old arsenal. Still, 8 George II forbade a higher day's wage than 2 shillings 7.5 pence for journeyman tailors in and around London, except in cases of general mourning. Still, 13 George III, Chapter 68, gave the regulation of the wages of silk weavers to the justices of the peace. Still, in 1706, it required 2 judgments of the higher courts to decide whether the mandates of justices of the peace as to wages held good also for non-agricultural laborers. Still, in 1799, an Act of Parliament ordered that the wages of the Scotch miners should continue to be regulated by a statute of Elizabeth and 2 Scotch Acts of 1661 and 1671. How completely, in the meantime, circumstances had changed is proved by an occurrence unheard of before in the English lower house. In that place, where for more than 400 years laws had been made for the maximum, beyond which wages absolutely must not rise, Whitbread in 1796 proposed a legal minimum wage for agricultural laborers. Pitt opposed this, but confessed that the, quote, condition of the poor was cruel, unquote. Thoughts and prayers, I guess. Finally, in 1813, the laws for the regulation of wages were repealed. They were an absurd anomaly, since the capitalist regulated his factory by his private legislation and could by the poor rates make up the wage of the agricultural labor to the indispensable minimum. The provisions of the labor statutes as to contracts between master and workman, as to giving notice and the like, which only allow of a civil action against the contract-breaking master, but on the contrary permit a criminal action against the contract-breaking workman, are to this hour, 1873, in full force. The barbarous laws against trades unions fell in 1825 before the threatening bearing of the proletariat. Despite this, they fell only in part. Certain beautiful fragments of the old statute vanished only in 1859. Finally, the Act of Parliament of June 29, 1871, made a pretense of removing the last traces of this class of legislation by legal recognition of trades unions. But an Act of Parliament of the same date, an act to amend the criminal law relating to violence, threats, and molestation, re-established in point of fact the former state of things in a new shape. By this parliamentary sleight of hand, the means which the laborers could use in a strike or lockout were withdrawn from the laws common to all citizens, and placed under exceptional penal legislation, the interpretation of which fell to the masters themselves in their capacity as justices of the peace. 2 years earlier, the same House of Commons and the same Mr. Gladstone, in the well-known straightforward fashion, brought in a bill for the abolition of all exceptional penal legislation against the working class. But this was never allowed to go beyond the second reading, and the matter was thus protracted until at last the, quote, great Liberal Party, by an alliance with the Tories, found courage to turn against the very proletariat that had carried it into power. Not content with this treachery, the great Liberal Party allowed the English judges, ever complacent in the service of the ruling classes, to dig up again the earlier laws against conspiracy, and to apply them to coalitions of laborers. We see that only against its will and under the pressure of the masses did the English Parliament give up the laws against strikes and trades unions, after it had itself for 500 years held with shameless egoism the position of a permanent trades union of the capitalists against the laborers. During the very first storms of the Revolution, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away from the workers the right of association but just acquired. By a decree of June 14, 1791, they declared all coalition of the workers as a, quote, attempt against liberty and the declaration of the rights of man, unquote. punishable by a fine of 500 livres, together with deprivation of the rights of an active citizen for 1 year. Footnote, Article 1 of this law runs, quote, as the abolition of any form of association between citizens of the same estate and profession is one of the foundations of the French Constitution, it is forbidden to re-establish them under any pretext or in any form, whatever they might be. Citizens belonging to the same profession, craft, or trade have joint discussions and make joint decisions with the intention of refusing together to perform their trade or insisting together on providing the services of their trade or their labors only at a particular price, then the said deliberations and agreements shall be declared unconstitutional, derogatory to liberty and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, etc. That's quoting Revolutions of Paris, 1791. Back to the main text. This law which, by means of state compulsion, confined the struggle between capital and labor within limits comfortable for capital, has outlived revolutions and changes of dynasties. Even the Reign of Terror left it untouched. It was but quite recently struck out of the penal code. Nothing is more characteristic than the pretext for this bourgeois coup d'etat. Granting, says Chapelier, the reporter of the Select Committee on this law, quote, that wages ought to be a little higher than they are, that they ought to be high enough for him that receives them, to be free of that state of absolute dependence, due to the want of the necessaries of life, and which is almost that of slavery, unquote. Yet the workers must not be allowed to come to any understanding about their own interests, nor to act in common, and thereby lessen their, quote, absolute dependence, which is almost that of slavery, unquote, because forsooth in doing this they injure, quote, the freedom of their ci-devant masters, the present entrepreneurs, unquote, and because a coalition against the despotism of the former masters of the corporations is, guess what, a restoration of the corporations abolished by the French Constitution. And that is the end of Chapter 28. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So thank you very much. We don't run ads on this channel. So if you like this channel, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life, so make sure to take what you've learned here into your real-world organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.